Hello, welcome to a live Abundant Living session 4A. Today we're going to talk about carb portioning. Of course, you remember our main classification of food into carbs, proteins, and vegetables. Of all the types of food on the plate of life, we've talked about how vegetables are the most important foods to eat because they are packed with nutrients and they have very few calories. As we said, you can't eat too many vegetables. Probably the most important thing that we can all do to improve and sustain our health is to eat more vegetables. For that reason, eating more vegetables is the main focus of the Alive program. As you remember, we encourage you to eat 3 cups of vegetables every day. To help you eat more vegetables, every other week our videos will focus on giving you more information about different kinds of vegetables that you may not have tried before and delicious ways to prepare them. In order to eat in a balanced way, we also need to include carbohydrates, protein, and healthy fats in our diet. So in some of the sessions, in addition to talking about delicious ways to eat more vegetables, we'll also talk a little more about carbs, proteins, and fats. And today we're going to focus on carbs. Remember, many different foods are classified as carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are foods that turn to sugar in your blood in order to fuel the body. Both sugar and starch in food turn to sugar in the body. So foods with sugar and/or starch are carbohydrates. Let's go over them more slowly. The most familiar carbohydrates are the starches, such as grains, rice, bread, pasta, and potatoes. This includes, of course, products of potatoes, such as potato chips and French fries. These are our prototypical carbohydrates. But don't forget about the other foods that are also carbohydrates. Many people don't realize that sweets like pop and other sugary drinks, as well as cake and cookies, are also carbs. You can remember this if you just remember that carbs are sugars and starches. Also, dried beans are carbohydrates too, although they are also higher in protein than many other carbs. Finally, starchy vegetables like corn and peas are also carbs. And don't forget about corn products such as Doritos and popcorn. Finally, the most surprising foods that are carbohydrates are milk and yogurt and fruit. Many people don't realize that these foods are also carbohydrates. And don't forget about fruit juices as well as jellies and jams. All of these are carbohydrate foods. And remember, cheese is not a carb. Cheese is a protein. So let's review. What makes a food a carbohydrate? Because it contains sugar or starch. If we take a microscope and look at a tiny piece of a carbohydrate food, we'll always see sugar or starch. All carbohydrate foods have sugar or starch, but protein foods have no sugar or starch. Vegetables have no sugar or starch. And fats have no sugar or starch. So that's what makes carbohydrate foods carbohydrates, is that they have sugar and starch. When you eat carbs, they turn into sugar in your blood, and the body uses the sugar as fuel. Remember, if you eat more carb than you burn, it turns to fat. Now let's talk about how much carb we should eat at a meal. Whereas you don't have to limit the amount of vegetables you eat, you should be aware of how much carb you're eating at each meal. As we learned in session 3, carbs are more calorie dense than vegetables. While we talk about portions of carbs, we'll use this plate as an example. The simplest way to estimate the correct portion of carb to eat at meals is to use your fist. 1 portion of carbs is the size of your fist, or about 1 cup. Your portion of carbs can be made up of all one food, for example, one fist-sized piece of cornbread. Your portion can also be made up of two different kinds of carb foods, as long as it's still about the size of one fist. Keep in mind that research shows that the fewer different types of foods you eat at a meal, the less you eat overall. Therefore, you might want to choose only one carb food per meal. Talking about food amounts can be a little bit confusing because nutritionists use the word serving in a special way. To you, a serving is probably how much of a food you put on your plate. But to nutritionists, the word serving refers to the amount of food that has a specific amount of a nutrient. For example, a serving of carb, for the nutritionist, is the amount of food that contains exactly 15 grams of carbohydrate. You don't have to remember that detail, but just remember that when we use the word serving in a nutrition context, we mean the amount of food that has a certain amount of a nutrient. Okay, now that we went over that, we can look at the carbohydrate foods handout that you got in Lesson 2. You can see that there are serving sizes listed next to each food. Those serving sizes refer to one nutrition serving of carbohydrate. At each meal, we suggest that you have no more than 2 servings of carbohydrate. If you want mac and cheese and sweet potatoes at a meal, you can have 1/3 cup of mac and cheese and 1/2 cup of sweet potatoes. Those are the serving sizes listed on the carbohydrate sheet. This amount is close to a fist, and this is the portion of carbohydrates that you should eat at one meal. Still hungry? If you're still hungry, we encourage you to eat more vegetables. As you know, you can't eat too many vegetables. However, if that doesn't seem satisfying, you also have your choice between an extra serving of fruit, milk, or yogurt. For example, you could have a cup of milk or a bowl of yogurt or a cup of fruit. The serving sizes on your carbohydrate foods sheet also help you determine how much fruit or milk you can have in addition to the fist of carbohydrate that is on your plate. Now think about how many times you may have eaten a typical plate with pasta, cornbread, and other carb foods, and also drank a sugar-sweetened beverage like iced tea, regular soda, or juice. This would be equal to about 7 fists of carbs and is packed with calories and sugar. This has been a lot of information. The main thing to remember is to be mindful of your carbs. If you eat too much carb, you'll be ingesting too much sugar for the health of your body, and it will quickly turn to fat. Unless, of course, you're running marathons regularly. Try to keep your carb portions to about the size of one fist. This is 2 servings on the carbohydrate sheet we gave you. If you want more, have a serving of milk, yogurt, or fruit. In Lesson 5, we'll talk a little more about carbs and blood sugar. In the meantime, have a great week.